sky, white clouds, and if there's a tree nearby, maybe the leaves of that maple tree, and insects and birds flitting past. While you're in the beam of light, however, looking at the reality of the world outside, you don't see the shed anymore. You also don't see the beam of light. You're in it, looking along it. That's your culture. Your culture is the beam of light along which you see the world. But while you're in your culture, you cannot see your culture. You can't see the way you see. You understand? Someone from another culture is like someone standing at a different part of the shed over here, looking out along their beam of light. Some of the things are the same. The sun is the same sun. The blue sky is the same blue sky. But maybe the clouds over here are gray or even dark. And the tree over here has needles instead of leaves. Now, I can say to you, the way I see the world, clouds are gray and trees have needles. And you can say, oh, you're crazy. The way I see the world, trees have leaves and clouds are white. Now, they're both right, aren't they? And don't the people over there who see a storm coming have something important to tell the people over here who don't? It's not a matter of right or wrong, it's just different. So my wife is in her beam of light, and what she's doing is perfectly obvious to her. I'm looking at her beam of light. And what she's doing doesn't make any sense. I can't judge it, I can't condemn it, but it doesn't make any sense to me until I can step into her beam of light, join her, and then I'll see what she sees. But I couldn't do it. Anyway, I went to a high school graduation. I was the commencement speaker. But the night before I got there early, I threw my sleeping bag on a bunk in the dormitory and hurried over to the dining hall where all the students were already eating. I sat down with my tray. And as I did, 5 or 6 Yupik teenagers surrounded me. They had heard that I could talk their language, but they clearly didn't believe it. Because as they sat down and I started eating my supper, they began bombarding me with questions. Kiduzit, who are you? I gave them my Yupik name, Athanasius. It means the little drifter, and I live up to it. Chamyonguzit, what town are you from? I wasn't going to say Allentown, Pennsylvania. That would blow my cover. So I sidestepped that and said, my wife is from the village of Huitluk. They were satisfied. They didn't. Then they asked me, Nakan Anshkozit. Literally, from where did you exit? It wasn't the question I was expecting. The last place I had exited was the dorm where I had thrown my sleeping bag. So I said, from the place where you sleep. They looked at me funny and shook their heads. It couldn't be. What did you ask? Repeat the question. They said it slower and louder. Naken Anshkozit. Doesn't help when you say it slower and louder. It doesn't. Last thing I came out of the airplane. From the airplane. No. Finally, I surrendered. I can't understand you. Where were you born? Not in the dorm of the airplane. But I realized that in their way of speaking, to exit and to be born was the same verb. Okay, back to my wife. I know, honey, I asked you this before, but when you're pregnant and you get up and you leave the house, is there anything special about what you do when you go out? Or how you go out? And she's in her beam of light. For her, it's obvious. Duh. Doesn't everybody know this? No, I don't. An expectant mother leaves the house early every morning, passing through the doorway, head first, without stopping. As I told you, Yupiks teach by imitating, watching and imitating. Baby, this is how you get born, please. Head first and don't stop. She's enacting birth every day. Now, where did my wife get that idea? Is it her own idea? No. Who taught her that? Her mother. Who taught her mother that? Her mother. Who taught her mother that? Her mother. It's believed the first mother taught the first daughter this. And ever since then, we have been doing this behavior. Now, I would say, because it starts in the beginning, and you keep doing it in remembrance or in imitation of your ancestors, by doing this, my wife puts herself in solidarity with all her ancestors, with all the Yupik women in the history of the world who have done exactly the same thing during their pregnancies. She also puts herself in solidarity with all the mothers who are contemporarily pregnant at the same time she is. So that's what makes this a meaningful behavior. It's not something she invented. It's not something she devised on her own. It's the way we, meaning the human beings, have always done it. And by behaving in this way, it's a moment of keros. That's keros. If she forgets to do it, that's her choice, but she's breaking the chain. But by doing it the way we've always done it, she puts herself in solidarity with her ancestors, and she puts herself consciously and deliberately in solidarity with all those who are also pregnant and doing the same thing that morning at the same time as she is. The Divine Liturgy on any given day is keros. But it's not a moment of keros, it's an hour and a half of keros. We don't invent it. It's the way we've always done it. We've been doing it this way for centuries, right? The Feast of Annunciation began on the new calendar halfway around the world. Whoever was the first one in the East, maybe in Japan, maybe in China, and then across Asia, then across India, then across the Middle East. The Americans are about the last one in the chain. But did we make it up as we go? No. By celebrating the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, we are in solidarity with all the Orthodox Christians since the time that liturgy was formally accepted, singing the same tropar, the same Kodak, reading the same scriptures as all the others. We don't often think about it this way, but the whole liturgy, actually when the deacon turns to the priest at the beginning of the liturgy in Greek, he turns to the priest and says, keros esti, meaningful time. He doesn't say chronos. Father, Son, it's 9:05. You see what I'm saying? He's using this other word for time when he says to the priest, keros esti, it's the meaningful time now. Forget your clocks. Forget your calendars. Forget the minutes. We're putting all that aside. We're entering into meaningful time now, sacred time, the time that keeps repeating, but is always meaningful. In the modern world, if it keeps repeating, it gets boring. In the sacred world, when you repeat it, it gets more meaningful. We're preparing for Pascha. We're not going to make up our own Easter service in a few weeks. That would be preposterous. We're going to have Pascha because it's going to be Palestine. We know what we're going to do, don't we? We know exactly what the ceremony is going to be. We know where we're going to walk. We know what the priest is going to say at the doors of the church. We know every word of the songs we're about to sing, but we can't wait to do it. That's chaos. And that's where I wanted to start, because I'm not going to say much about St. Innocent. He's on our iconostas here. And I can give you his thumbnail biography, because I can assume, like with St. Herman, you already know a lot about him. He was born in 1797 in Siberia. He was an orphan. He was raised by his uncle. His uncle was the starosta of the church warden. He went to it says seminary, but seminary in rural Russia was high school. He basically had a high school diploma. And then he was the best student in his class. He was given originally the name Ioan, and his last name was Popov, which like in Russia is John Smith. The most common possible name you could possibly have. Because there were probably several other John Smiths in his own class, the faculty changed his last name to Benjamin, in honor of the bishop who had recently died, Bishop Benjamin of Irkutsk. So he became Ioan Veniaminov. They wanted to send him to Europe for graduate studies. They wanted him to go to Europe and become a professor of theology. He was the best in the class. He refused. Instead, he volunteered for Oleksa. He and his wife and little daughter and mother-in-law went to Sitka, where he started learning Unangan Aliyut. The people in Sitka were mostly Aliyut. And then he devised an alphabet for Unangan, for Aliyut. He went to the Aleutian Islands and spent a decade there, devising an alphabet for the language, translating the Gospel of Matthew, a catechism, a church history, or rather a Bible story book, textbooks for teaching the Unangan language to the Aliyut people themselves. He opened that school, he began teaching the kids. Father Gideon had already done this on Kodiak Island. That's what Orthodox people do. You come to the place, you learn the language, and if they don't have an alphabet, then you have to invent one, so you can give them the Holy Scripture and the church services. He designed and built a cathedral there. He traveled 10 years in a kayak from village to village. And I told you the story yesterday of how he encountered the shaman and talked shop with the shaman last night. I won't repeat the story. He learned Unangan, built the church, ran the school, and then they transferred him to Sitka. Sitka is a trinket area. The language is totally different. The climate is totally different. The Aleutian Islands are volcanic islands with no trees, just high grass. Sitka is against the mountains. It's huge spruce trees. Everything is made of wood. The people speak a language that's one of the most difficult in the world. He learned Tlingit. He devised an alphabet for Tlingit. He built the church in Sitka. He was doing such a good job after these many decades. He wrote a book called Notes on the Unalaska District. The flora, the fauna, the meteorology. He was keeping weather records wherever he went. Rainfall, wind speed, temperatures. It's the earliest scientific record of anything in Alaska. The language and the culture of the people. And then he sent his books to Russia to be printed. After another year, the books came back. He finally had textbooks for his school. With so many typographical errors, they were useless. Obviously, nobody in St. Petersburg could proofread. There was no one there who knew the language, right? So the errors were so bad, years of work, and now useless. He and his wife, and now 6 kids, had been in Alaska a dozen years. They petitioned for him to go to Europe to supervise the publication of his books himself. He's the only one who could do it. And the wife and kids, the children mostly had never seen Russia. They were going to go home to see grandparents. We understand this as grandparents. They wanted to see their homeland and their family. So Mama and the kids crossed the Bering Sea and went to Siberia. Yuan Benyaminov sailed to Honolulu, Sydney, Australia, Cape Town, South Africa, the Canary Islands. It's halfway around the world either which way you go. And months later arrived in St. Petersburg, where news had already arrived that his wife in Siberia had suddenly died. His first impulse, of course, was to forget the books and go back to reunite with his children. But Emperor Nicholas I had been reading his book and wanted to meet this guy from the other end of the world. He was summoned to the Winter Palace. The Tsar said to him, "I'm very sorry to hear about your wife." Father Johann says, "Well, I've got to get out. I have to go." It was too late for the funeral. She had been buried weeks before. But his children, the emperor said, "I'll take care of the kids. They're old enough, all of them, to be in school. I'll pay for their tuition. They can go to school here. We need men like you back in Alaska, and I want you to go back as bishop." He had absolutely no ambition in his life to be a bishop. He often wrote what a terrible monk he would make. He just wasn't called to that. But the Metropolitan of Moscow, Filaret, met him and said, "You really have to pray about this, Father-in-law." So he went to the monastery of the caves in Kiev and prayed, and came back and said, "God's will be done." So they ordained him Bishop of Alaska and sent him back. He crossed Siberia this time. He didn't go by boat around the world. And he prayed at his wife's grave. He saw his children. And he continued on to Sitka, where he built the first Orthodox seminary in the New World. But it wasn't just a theological seminary. It trained accountants, map makers, cartographers, architects, shipbuilders, nurses and doctors. He was training the native people to sustain their language and culture, but also to run the colony. Because, I think I mentioned this last night, it was forbidden for a Russian to come to Alaska as a colonist and stay. They could come on contract with the company and work for the company until their contract ran out. After the contract ran out, by law, they had to go back. They were not colonizing Alaska. They were training the Alaska Native people to run Alaska. And the school was going to do that. Then he designed and built St. Michael's Cathedral in the middle of the main street in the capital city, Sitka. St. Michael's in those days, New Archangel. And he was doing such a good job. Tlingit language, Tlingit school, building churches. The Holy Synod gave him Kamchatka as well. That's the other side of the Bering Sea. So now he has the entire North Pacific Ocean to handle. It would take him as a bishop 2 years to make one circuit of his villages. He was doing such a good job, they moved him to Yakutsk, the coldest, darkest, most forbidding place in Siberia, where he learned the Yakut language, devised an alphabet for them, and opened their first schools. By 1868, he was 71 years old. He got a telegram. He had been elected Metropolitan of Moscow. He was not pleased. He was ready to retire. He'd spent his whole life in Alaska and Siberia, where he was from. But now to be Metropolitan of Moscow. He shows up in Moscow under duress. Filaret had died. Filaret, his predecessor, was an aristocrat. Filaret had 6 PhDs. spoke several different European languages, was an aristocrat and now he's the successor with a high school diploma. So he stands before this group in the imperial capital, Uspensky Sobor, Dormition Cathedral in the Moscow Kremlin, and who's there? The faculty of the seminary he never attended, with all their doctoral degrees, right? The emperor and the royal family. I don't have verbatim, but the gist of his acceptance speech is, I'm really too old for this job. I don't know why I came. The guy before me was a genius with all these degrees. Any comparison between us will reflect very badly on me. I understand that that's going to happen, and there's no way I can avoid it. For reasons of health, I could have declined this position. But the Holy Synod voted for this, and the Emperor approved it, and who am I to contradict them? So, in obedience, I've come. And then he turns to the faculty of the theological school, and he says, you do not deserve an illiterate hierarch like me. And he turns to the audience, all these thousands of people in the cathedral, and says, please pray for me, brothers and sisters, that through my stupidity nothing bad happens. This is this genius who has been a missionary on the frontier all his life, who has learned these languages, wrote the books, started the schools, and now this is in all humility how he begins his ministry. There are very few geniuses who are also humble, but that's innocent enemy. And one last thing. In 1868, just before he moved to Moscow, he wrote to St. Petersburg, to the Holy Synod. It's a very diplomatic letter. He says, remember, he's in Yakutsk, in the coldest of the boondocks, right? He's writing to the Holy Synod, and he says, rumor has reached me in Yakutsk. As soon as I read that, I thought, how did rumors ever get to Yakutsk? This is a literary device, right? Rumor has reached me in Yakutsk that I am against the sale of Alaska to the United States. Nothing could be further from the truth. I see this as a great missionary opportunity. By this means, Orthodoxy will come to America. 1868! And if I were to be asked, of course no one had asked him, but this is the point. I would recommend this. Do not close the diocese, but move the headquarters to San Francisco. The climate is much better there. And he'd been there. He'd been to Fort Ross, so he knew by firsthand. He went to Fort Ross to close it down because it was sold to John Sutter. You remember John Sutter? Sutter's Mill. Gold Rush. He went there to close it down, and Franciscans showed up because they heard there was this Orthodox priest coming. And they'd never met an Orthodox priest. And he'd never met a Catholic priest. So they conversed using his high school Latin. I took 2 years of high school Latin. I couldn't converse in it even when I was fresh, let alone 40 years later. But again, you see the genius of this man. But if I were to be asked, don't close the mission, but move the headquarters to San Francisco. And appoint a bishop in San Francisco who speaks English. And translate our church services into English. And give the bishop there permission to ordain any Americans who convert to Orthodoxy and are willing to accept the canons and teachings of our holy faith. I see by this sale the opportunity to bring Orthodoxy to the Americans. 1868. We're still hoping to have another bishop who has this vision. But this is his entire... So, that's why he's up there. He had a colleague and a friend, 2 years younger, only 2 years younger, who was born in the Aleutian Islands. His mother was Aleut, Unan. His father was Russian. So he's what is called in our census a Creole. Not anything to do with Louisiana. It's just what the Russians call the children of these intermarriages. Jacob Netsvetov. He went to the same seminary as St. Innocent Veniaminov, a couple years behind. And when he married there. He met a Russian woman and married Anna Semyonova, and they came to the village of Atka. The Aleutian Islands, that chain of islands that come from the mainland of Alaska and stretch almost to Kamchatka, is 1,000 miles long. It's a very long chain. This is where Veniaminov was the only priest going up and down this chain in a kayak. Now, Veniamina was going to take the eastern half, and Netsvetov will have the western half. All the way to Japan, by the way. He had parishes just north of Hokkaido. If you can imagine doing this by kayak. And he builds a church in Atka, in the middle of the ocean chain, and his wife gets sick. So they sent her to the hospital in Sitka, 2,000 miles more away to the east, where she died. That same year, Father Yaakov's house burned down. He translated the Gospel of Mark, Luke, and John, and the Acts of the Apostles into Unanganali. He built his own house, his own church, and his own school, so he was following the lead of Johann Veniaminov, his friend and neighbor. But Veniaminov became bishop. Jacob Netsvetov just stayed in Atka 20 years. But he was there as a bachelor. His wife had died. He was there alone. His house had burned down. They were planning to adopt a nephew who caught pneumonia and also died. So his life was not particularly happy, and in that isolation, 20 years. So at the end of 20 years, he wrote to his bishop, Johann Veniaminov, Innocent Veniaminov, and requested retirement. Veniaminov wrote back, of course, Father Jacob, I know your life. I know how hard it's been. You deserve, after 20 years, to retire. I will allow you to retire as soon as I find a replacement. Famous words. Yes. 18 years later, he finally retired. And he didn't spend those 18 years in Atka, in his homeland, with his own people. He was assigned to the Yupik Eskimo people. He became the apostle to the Yupiks. He learned the Yupik language. He devised an alphabet to write down their language. He produced the hymnals, the first hymnals, and he built the first church in the Yupik region, Holy Cross. And when I first came to Alaska, we still had Yaakov Netsvetov's hymnals and prayer books with the adapted Cyrillic alphabet, adapted to the Yupik language. My father-in-law always insisted that was the best way to write Yupik. He could read that just like naturally. I always had trouble because there were all these diacritical marks and dots and dashes and accent marks that would confuse me, but there were Yupik elders in my time who insisted that Yaakov Netsvetov's writing system was the best they ever had for their language. He spent 18 years on the Yukon River, again up and down the river. He got mail once a year. And together he had to paddle down the Yukon River, out into the Bering Sea, to the outpost at St. Michael, get all his supplies, candles, flour, wine, all his mail, and paddle back up the river. So he never went alone because he had a lot of cargo to bring up the river. And he had two helpers. They were Creoles themselves. One was half Indian and half Russian, and the other was half Yupik and half Russian. Because there were Indians upriver and Eskimos downriver, and with these two brothers, he could communicate with. He had translators to take him wherever he needed to go. I just relate to you two stories about Father Yaakov. One, he went down. He was kidnapped by the Indians. The Indians upriver kept inviting him and inviting him and inviting him. In 1848, he did go up the river and baptize a few people. But it wasn't his territory. He was assigned to be an evangelist and missionary to the Yupiks. So they kept inviting him. He said, yeah, next year. Finally, in 1853, they came and got him. Get in the boat. They paddled him up the river 4 days. He says, they put me ashore, and I waited all day. Nothing was happening, just in this little hut. By evening, they said, okay, come. And they walked him out to the riverbank, and this river, the Innoko River, is probably as wide as this church. It's not huge, but it's pretty wide. He counted on the Innoko River, an area like I said, about this wide, over 100 vessels, canoes, kayaks, and one sailboat. Over 100 vessels, hundreds of Indian people converging there at their own initiative. Tell us your stories. He began with Genesis, and 4 days later he came to Pentecost. So it was a very detailed, evangelical event, let's put it that way. At the end of 4 days of preaching, they all agreed unanimously and requested baptism. So he baptized the men on the next day, the women on the next day, and the teenagers and the children on the 7th day. So it was 4 days of preaching, 3 days of baptizing. He writes in his report, from this activity, I became dreadfully tired. And then he says, the sight of so many newly baptized Christians Praying together to the true God gives me such joy that all my aches and pains have left. Now, they were people of different tribes, former enemies. And because of the preaching of this little Aleut missionary from the Aleutian Islands, from a very tiny island out in the middle of the Bering Sea, now these Indian people accepted to worship the true God and to be, what did he preach about? Peaceful coexistence between people of all nations. And there has never been another war between those tribes since. That was the gift of St. Jacob Netsvetov to these people. The end of his life was rather tragic. It's my second story. Well, I have to interrupt. There's a good story I have to tell you. And 2 years later, 1855, the village of Ikogamut, Russian mission they call it. It's a bad name because there were never any Russians there. It could have been called Aleut mission, but they named it Russian mission because the people who looking out rather than looking along, the people looking at this culture said they were Russians because they were Orthodox, I suppose. But there were never any Russians in Russian mission, only Aleuts intermarried with Eutychs. But anyway, he's at this little village, and they're on food. It's March. It's about this time of year. But the food supply, the fish from last year, the supply for some reason is running out. And he writes in his report to the bishop, March, 23rd, 1853, food supply running low. A couple days later, food supply becoming desperately short. I'm sending my helper, Constantine, out to hunt, to find food. The next day, food exhausted, children crying, people going hungry. Next day, situation desperate, starvation imminent. Next day, thanks be to God, Constantine has returned to the village with 3 caribou. Okay. Now we have the copy not from him in Russian mission. We have the copy that the bishop got in Sitka. The Bishop Paul in that time, was apparently an old school teacher or college professor. Because we don't just have Father Yaakov's report, we have the bishop's reaction in pencil written in the margins. So you get to the section, situation becoming desperate. In the margin, the bishop writes, Господи помилуй. You have starvation imminent, Боже мой, right? Oh my God, right? And then, this is the clincher, at the end, thanks be to God, Constantine has returned with 3 caribou. And the bishop writes in the margin, мясо через посту, meat during Lent, It's the most graphic example I have ever seen of someone sitting at headquarters having no idea how it's like, right? Finally, I said the end of his life was rather tragic because he was sickly. He was in bed most of Lent, almost every year. I think he had rheumatism or arthritis or both. Rheumatoid arthritis. He was crippled practically. What kept him going? There were no dispensaries. There was no one to give him an aspirin. Right? No way to... And he talks about how his legs especially are aching. He had a tent. It was below 0 to go to church. So to get out of bed and to walk painfully and to go to the tent church to celebrate Holy Week services, it was physically painful and difficult. Every year after year, I checked all his reports. Year after year for 18 years, what kept him going was Pascha. It's absolutely amazing how he even mentions how hard it is to get out of bed, how difficult this week, how painful his back, his legs, whatever. And then on Pascha, it all disappears. We had such a radiant, beautiful, joyful day today. Like worth all the Lenten effort and all his suffering. It was Pascha year after year that we never did. And it's a question I would like to pose to you. Those of you especially in the choir, but not only, and the priests too, but not only. Aren't there moments, any time of the year, at any liturgy, but especially during Holy Week, and most especially on Pascha itself, when you're serving or singing, and all of a sudden, completely unexpected and not self-provoked at all, just completely by almost surprise, You are so overwhelmed with a sense of peace and joy that you can't continue.
That's true.
That if you try, you would cry. You know what I'm talking about? That's the peace of God that passes all understanding. You can't provoke it. You can't instill it. You can't whip yourself into an emotional frenzy and get it. If you do that, you'll never get it, actually. The only way to receive it is to remain perfectly calm, self-controlled, and sober, and simply concentrate on what you're doing, the prayers and the hymns. And then it hits you. And you have no idea when it's going to happen. So it always catches you by surprise. That's the Holy Spirit. That's the joy of the kingdom of God. That's a taste of paradise. That's what it is. And we have the joy of experiencing it here on earth when we're still in our earthly bodies. That's what we come to church for. But you can't pray for it, you can't ask for it, you can't even anticipate it, and you definitely can't provoke it. But it's just a reality that we know. I'm sure that's what filled St. Jacob Netsvetov every year at Pascha. And no matter how much it hurt, he had to get out of bed with a cane or two and with maybe his 2 subdeacons supporting him. And he died at the age of 60. He wasn't that old. But he wore himself out in the wilderness. 38 years as a priest. So, to me, St. Yaakov is the priest, the very symbol, the embodiment of paschal joy. The icon that I requested to be painted for him for his canonization shows him in his paschal white vestments. I think we should, in my opinion, he should always be portrayed, always depicted in an icon as if it were Pascha. Because it was that joy that inspired and energized him, but it was also the realization that there are others who have never known that joy. And it's to bring that joy and to make it possible to others. That's the whole point of the mission. Because once you have had that experience, you know everything that we say in the creed is true. And you don't just know it with your brain. You know it with your heart and your whole being. But only an Orthodox Pascha can do that for you. I had plenty of theological training. I had catechetical class and all the rest. But once you've had that paschal joy, you are an Orthodox Christian forever. Because you don't just know it with your head, you figured it out. It's not something you figure out. Yes, the biblical training, the scriptural studies, that's all necessary. Otherwise you wouldn't know who we're singing about. That inspired Habakkuk stands with us in Holy Vigil. Who's that? We wouldn't know. And like Jonah from the whale on the third day that was rise from the tomb. You have to know who Jonah was. Otherwise, so you do need the biblical training. It gives you the context, but ultimately, knowing all of that is not enough. It's not a matter of just the head, although it includes the head. It's not without mind. It's not without purpose. It's not without reason. And it's not a matter of whipping yourself into an emotional frenzy, as some people think. That the gift of the Holy Spirit is only there when you're kind of all... No. But it includes emotion, but not an emotion that you can instill or provoke or whip yourself into. You've got to be sober to do this, and then it just hits you. It's a gift from God. And that's what it's the realization of that experience that kept St. Jacob going for 38 years in the wilderness. Now, he kept asking for help. He had this huge territory. They sent him help. But who did they send from Russia to help him into Alaska? Did anyone volunteer to go to Alaska in 1844? No. They sent the priests who didn't want to go, but they were trying to get rid of. They sent him literally crazy priests. And unfortunately, there are crazy politicians, God knows, and crazy doctors and teachers and people, unfortunately, the mentally challenged can join almost any profession. They join also the church and they can become clergy. And this man was clearly deranged. They sent him to St. Michael's, his head, the place where the ships docked every year. And he began almost immediately writing horrible accusations against St. Yaakov and Constantine and his brother Ivan, calling them mass murderers, saying they were going up and down the river killing people. It's an absolutely preposterous allegation, but the new bishop insisted they didn't know who was who. Ordered them all to report to him and get to the bottom of this. So St. Yaakov packed up his bags and went to Sitka, where he died. He was exonerated, but he died. No one in Sitka knew who this old Aleut priest was. They buried him, but we don't know where. We lost him. But before he died, he found his wife's grave. Because remember, she had died in Sitka years before. There's a tombstone over her. It's about 4 feet long, and it's in an inscription. At this place lies Anna Semyonovna Netsvetova, wife of Archpriest Jacob Netsvetov, who was born on her birthday, I don't remember, who died on the day of her death, and at this place awaits the resurrection on the last day. It's a beautiful inscription, but they had no children. Who else would know her birthday? You know who put that there. It was him. And then he was forgotten. 100 years in Yaakov Netsvetov, Jacob, nobody even remembered he existed. People enacted it because he was the founder of that church and he was from there and he had started their school and built there. And I'm told that he even painted the icons for that original church in the 1820s. It was burned by the U.S. Navy in 1941. We lost it. And then he was remembered to some extent by the Yupik people. But otherwise, 25 years ago, I went to Ikogimut, the so-called Russian mission. They built a new church. The oldest church, or the more recent church, was on a hill overlooking the village. But, wood does not last forever. After 30, 40 years, it's all rotting and kind of falling down. And the village realized they have to build a new church. So they built the new church back where the old one was that St. Yaakov had built down by the riverbank. So the old church was sitting there kind of derelict on the hill. And I don't remember why, it was a sunny warm day in August. The bishop said, let's go look at the old church. And I'm thinking, why look at the old church? There's nothing in it. All the icons were taken down and put in the new church, but we went up anyway. And there was another tombstone there. It was Father Shayashnikov's wife. He had put a tombstone for his wife where he's buried. We don't know either. But the wives, the Matushka, at least got memorials. And then we go inside the church and it's all empty. There's nothing there, as we expected. Everything had been removed and put into the new building. But as we were going out, on the porch, there was a kind of ladder going up the wall. The rungs were nailed right to the wall. It wasn't a movable ladder, it was just rungs. And then a trapdoor. The bishop said, someone climb up there and see if there's anything in the attic. And another priest, still a young one, climbed up there. He looked up there. He actually went all the way up. And he said, no, it's dark up here, I can't see anything, but there doesn't seem to be anything here. Maybe he had a flashlight, I don't remember. But then as he came back to the entry, he tripped over something. A box about this size. Oh, wait a minute, there is something here. I almost fell over it. What is it? Oh, it's a wooden box, a crate of some kind. The bishop said, well, bring it down. Let's see what's in it. So I remember very clearly reaching up and having to lower this box. It was full of books. 18 years of the journals, the reports of Jacob Netsvetov. Everything he did, every day, most of it pretty boring. I had a baptism today, I had a funeral today, I had kids from church school today, but that's how we know about his being kidnapped by the Indians. When he became dreadfully tired, that's in there. That's how we know this. We almost fell over it, literally, and brought it down. And that's translated in my first book, Orthodox, Alaska Missionary Spirituality. 1/3 of it is translations of those journals. Otherwise, we also wouldn't know anything about him. One thing I have to say finally about Yaakov Netsvetov. If he's not a saint, as a married priest, there's no hope for the rest of us. We tend to complain about things, don't we? The mail was slow. He got mail once a year. The church was drafty. He was in a tent at below zero temperature. Almost anything that we could complain about, the bishop was mean to me. His bishop summoned him to leave the parish and go thousands of miles on completely absurd charges. You see what I'm saying? Almost anything we as priests can complain about, he had it worse. And he persevered. And what allowed him to do it? Pasta. That's what it's about. And that's what kept Yaakov Netsvetov going. And he gave this spirit to the Yupik people. I'm not going to tell the whole story of St. Olga again. Although maybe a few of you heard it last night. As long as the clock is not going to. Okay.
I'm going to take it off.
Okay. When I wrote this book in the late 80s, toward the end I thought, this is the history, it's all of the past. It's maybe inspiring to some extent. That's what we've been talking about here today, the history. St. Herman, St. Juvenal, St. Makar, St. Yaakov, St. Innocent. But there's more. There's the church today in Alaska. And people will ask me, what's that like? So someplace in here, I wrote just a section, not even a whole chapter, called Alaska's Mission, the church's mission to Alaska, and then the last part is Alaska's mission to the church. Because I believe now it's time to reverse this. We've been receiving missionaries for hundreds of years, but Alaska now, I believe, given this 200 years of heritage, has something, I hope you'll agree, has something to tell and remind the rest of the church. So on page 203, and then only up to page 206, 3 pages, I decided to give people a taste of what Alaska's like by writing 3 pages only about Matushka Olga. Matushka Olga was the priest's wife in our village, but she didn't become a priest's wife until she was rather elderly because her husband had been the postmaster. He was literate in English and in Yupik, but her husband was the postmaster. And when our own priest suddenly died, the bishop came for the funeral and said to the postmaster, this village is going to need a new priest, and you're the most qualified. So the postmaster, who had been the reader in the church and sung in the choir, agreed. And he went off to Sitka. They spent several months there training him, and he came home a priest, which made her, in her late 50s, the new Matushka. So she made all the vestments, she sewed all the altar covers, she baked all the prosphora. She knew everything by heart, as most of our people do. We just know man's liturgy. Dust and Troparia. St. Yaakov Netsvetov translated them, but very few people could read. So the program was, you sing it and sing it and sing it until you know it by heart. I remember seeing this Sunday afternoon at Russian Mission, and people would say, what should we do? No radio, no TV? Well, let's practice for Palm Sunday. It's July. You don't need to practice Palm Sunday. It's not coming up for 10 more months. Just sit there, and if they forgot the words, they had the book. Oh, wait, well, okay, now I'll start this one. And they would sing. And this is how they simply spent the Sunday afternoons, practicing for the next great feast. And it was all by memory. So, actually, I was at the Shaker, Pleasant Hill, yesterday, and there was a young woman performing Shaker hymns. And she did it from memory. And I said, they don't have pews with books. I said, in the old days, how did the Shakers sing? They knew it all by heart. So this is not just us Orthodox. When I went to church as a child, everyone in our parish sang the liturgy of John Chrysostom in Slavonic. There wasn't a book in the place. They just knew it. They sang it, keros, in the traditional melodies. Now we can't do anything without a book. But maybe this is the brain damage that literacy does. We're so dependent on it, we don't even realize that we never memorize it. They memorized in English, The Russian Mission could sing the whole liturgy in Slavonic if they had to. They could sing it in English if they wanted to. They could sing it in Yupik if they wanted to. And once you know it in your own language, it doesn't really matter what language you sing. You just know. Right? So she was like that. She was constantly busy. She was a modern Tabitha or Dorcas, always crocheting, knitting, sewing something to give away. Not because she needed it, not even because her children needed it, although she often gave away her own children's clothes when she saw another child who needed a new dress or coat. She became sick and was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And her daughters went to Kodiak for the annual pilgrimage, which is every year, August 7, 8, and 9. They told the bishop about her condition. She was bedridden back home. And the bishop served in a coppice before the reliquary of St. Herman. Her daughters returned, and their bedridden mother was not in bed. At first they were alarmed. Did they rush her to the hospital? Where's Mom? They turned around, and she was coming in the door with buckets of water that she had fetched from the village well. She was that recovered that fast, and for at least a year, she was healthy. But the remission didn't last. The following year, as she was ailing and failing, she began giving instructions. Don't mourn for me. I'm going to be okay. Bury me in my wedding gown. Tell the children at the high school not to worry. her grandchildren who had gone to boarding school. The day she died, she sat up in bed. The priest brought her communion. She looked to the icons, crossed herself, folded her arms across her breast, and lay down and fell asleep. It was the Christian ending to life that we pray for, painless, blameless, and peaceful. It was November. The river thawed. The wind blew. The ice melted. And people came to her funeral by boat, which is unheard of in winter. When they brought her coffin from the church, birds circled above the church as they carried her coffin to the graveyard. Our birds are smart enough to leave in August. Where these birds came from, there's no explanation. The men who dug her grave said it was like summertime when the ground is sandy and easy to dig. In winter, it freezes like concrete, and you have to chisel through it with picks and shovels, but not her grave. And after they buried her, the Yupiks have this wonderful tradition of singing the hymn, Having Beheld the Resurrection of Christ, as the grave is being filled, ringing the bell like a Pascha. Not just Vechnaya Pamyat, Memory Eternal, but end the funeral with Paschal hymns. So as they filled in the grave, the wind started to blow. And the people hurried to their boats and went home. And that night the river froze again. It was as if the earth itself had opened to receive her. This is what I wrote here. I didn't bother to read it. I sort of remember what I wrote. 10 years went by. I didn't think much of it. I got a letter from a lady in upstate New York. She said, I had this vision. Or maybe it was a dream. It's not clear. In my vision, I was in a forest, and the Mother of God, the Virgin Mary, came toward me. I knew exactly who it was. She walked past me and signaled, look behind me. She kept going. She looked behind, and there was a shorter woman who signaled, follow me. So I followed this woman out into a clearing, and there was a sod house. She called it the Hill House. Those of you who have seen the Hobbit movies know what I mean. It's like a hill covered with grass, and that's exactly what it looked like. But on the other side, as they circled around, there was a door, and they kind of bent down and crawled in. Inside there was a lamp, a stone bowl with oil. This house is exactly what Yupik people lived in 100 years ago and into the past. The stone bowl with oil and flame in it is exactly the lamps that they used in pre-contact Alaska. This woman described the smell of how the tundra is in the autumn. Exactly. She compared it to certain spices, but it's exactly right. She's never been to Alaska. She has no way of knowing any of these things. The woman, still without speaking, gestured for her to lie down, and she lay down. Then this woman began to treat her, massage her, as if she were giving birth, but she wasn't pregnant. But this woman had been physically abused as a child. And the trauma, the darkness, the physical and spiritual pain she had suffered, she says, left her body. She felt whole and healed for the first time since she was a child. Then this lady helped her up. And they went outside, and now it was dark, and the northern lights filled the sky, the aurora. And they were moving around. She said, I didn't know until then that they moved. And then this woman, there was a fire and a kettle, and she served me tea, Labrador tea. We call it tundra tea. And she described again its fragrance exactly right. There's no way for some lady in upstate New York to know any of these things, even if you tried to research it. It's impossible. Finally, the woman spoke. She pointed to the sky and she said, this is a sign from God of His ability to create great beauty where there had only been darkness and desolation. And then she started to walk away. And the lady with the vision yelled after her, who are you? And this lady said, something Olga. Something she didn't understand, but Olga she got. And she came out of this vision or dream. Then she went to her therapist, who happened to be an Orthodox priest's wife. She said, I just had this dream of this lady with a last name Olga. Or, is there a Saint Olga? Oh, of course there's a Saint Olga. And they showed her an icon of Saint Olga, Princess of Kiev. That's not the lady I saw. There's some other Olga. And because I had written those 3 pages in the back of this book, Matushka Helen said, well, maybe you meant Matushka Olga. Yeah, that's it. What's a Matushka? She wasn't Orthodox. She didn't know. And they said, Matushka Olga is a priest's wife in Alaska. Well, how will I know if that's the Olga I met? Write to Father Oleksa. Hence the letter. But I was leaving for Russia the next day, and I had no time to send this lady a photograph of Matushka Olga to make a positive ID. So I left. A year later, I came home, and this lady had not given up. When she didn't hear from me, she wrote to the family of Matushka Olga, Kwiatek, Alaska, 99621, hoping that someone from the family could send her a picture of Matushka Olga. And I happened to come to visit, and the family said, we got this letter so many months ago from this lady in New York. Have you heard of her? Oh, yeah. I got a letter from her, but I never answered her. I didn't have time. I didn't have a chance. So they said they got the letter. The first daughter read the letter 3 times because she couldn't believe what she was reading. And after she finished reading the letter, it was as if her house was filled with the sweet fragrance of incense. This startled her. She ran over to her brother's house. The brother wasn't home. She turned to his wife and said, give this to Ivan, and you can read it too if you want to. So his wife read the letter, also 3 times. The first time incredulous, the second time sitting down. The third time, she sensed the house was filled with the sweet fragrance of incense. The husband came home. You got to read this. She didn't say anything more and left. The husband read the letter, sat down and read it again, read it the 3rd time. Didn't smell incense. But he went to the neighbor nearby, shut-in lady he visited every day. As he entered her house, she said to him, teasing, what's that perfume you're wearing? So he was actually enveloped with this fragrance of incense. So this was our first. Then I came and they said, what should we do? I said, do you have a picture of your mother with other women? So that, she can identify her out. They sent the picture. She identified Matushka Olga, except she said, when I met her, she was younger than this. We have this experience when people who have passed away appear to us, they're in their youth. Yeah. When my mother died, my neighbor had a vision of her and my father, who had died 40 days earlier, the 2 of them. And she said, I saw your mother and father, but they were like they were when they first bought that house 50 years ago. So in heaven, we're all restored to our best physical condition. And this is really what the saints and angels and the icons are meant to represent. Not as they looked in their old age, not as they looked as a portrait, but as they will be in the future kingdom. An icon is the resurrection of that person and their resurrected body in the kingdom which is to come. An icon is not a representation of the past. An icon is a vision of the future. Just as the church itself is not just a representation or remembrance of the past. It is the remembrance of Christ. As we say after the communion, take, eat, this is my body, drink of this, remembering this saving commandment, and all those things that have come to pass for us. The cross, the tomb, the resurrection on the 3rd day, the ascension into heaven, the sitting at the right hand of the Father, and his second and glorious coming. The liturgy is our participation in the future. We're not going back to the upper room. Otherwise, why would we need incense and icons and candles and vestments? That wasn't there, was it, in the upper room? The liturgy is our participation, that we eat and drink at his kingdom, which is to come. The church is the remembrance of the future, and the icons of that. So, as we experience this together, brothers and sisters, I believe Matushka Olga certainly, we've had other experiences, other appearances. She has come to people who are deeply troubled. She has appeared to women, especially those who have been physically and sexually abused. Her icon hangs in every women's shelter in Alaska. There's an akathist to her already. In fact, a recent book of akathists included the akathist to Matushka Olga. So her veneration has gradually spread throughout North America, and even we built the St. Herman of Alaska Church last year in Kenya, the only St. Herman of Alaska church in all of Africa. But the bell tower, which is being built now, I just got pictures this morning. The bell tower is going to be the Blessed Mother Matushka Olga bell tower to accompany the St. Herman of Alaska church. So, this is God. I'm convinced this is just like those moments of intense joy that we mentioned. It's not something human beings can provoke. It's not something human beings can instill. It's not something we do. It's something given. It's the Holy Spirit that just comes. The same with Matushka Olga. She might have been forgotten. I wrote 3 pages about her 30 years ago. This woman in New York had no way of knowing any of this, but through her, Matushka Olga has been revealed. And these other women who have experienced her, to whom she has appeared, all testify that they at one point in their life were physically or emotionally, deeply in some way harmed. And their encounter with her has been a healing experience. How can we account for this? We can't. We're not in charge. They say Pope John the 23rd went to bed every night saying, I've done my best, Lord. It's your church. I'm going to bed. It's a good prayer, isn't it? We do the best we can, but in the end, it's not ours. It's God's. And Matushka Olga is therefore, I think, there to remind us the story continues. My last point. I was in St. George Cathedral in Detroit last Sunday. It's nicely frescoed all around, like St. Andrew's Church is here with all the icons. But they did something special there. From about here down, and in some churches they have it much lower, but in St. George Cathedral, it's almost 3 feet high. The last part of all, there's Christ and the saints and the biblical scenes, and around the edge, the martyrs and the angels and such. But from here down, it's a curtain. It's a white curtain. It's not physically a curtain. It's not made of cloth. It's a painted curtain on the wall. This is very traditional in monasteries and in churches both. It says, the story begins with Christ and the apostles, the evangelists, and all these scenes. And the story keeps going and going and going until it comes right here. And then the curtain is the unknown future. But it says, since this is where we're standing, we're part of that story too. And now it's for us, taking all of this into consideration, what do we do with it? Right? Having all this revealed and all these saints and St. Herman and St. Innocent and St. Jacob and Matushka Olga now, okay, now it's your turn. We have to write the next chapter. What will the next chapter be? Will we be just as courageous as Father Herman? Will we be just as committed as St. Innocent? Will we be willing to sacrifice everything like St. Juvenali? Will we be filled with pastoral joy like St. Jacob? And then, what will we do with it? This is what ultimately the Church is telling us with all this iconography. You're responsible. The curtain has not yet been filled in. But we are the Church of God, in this case, called to Kentucky, called to be saints, called to write the next chapter of the story to the glory of God and by His grace.
We have a photo of everyone today, right with Father Michael on the Soleils and everyone off to the sides.
Well, come.